For the average migrant in the middle of the 19th century, there was no more suitable destination than the United States. In a relatively quick time period, the country was undergoing rapid and transformative growth, with cities in the North, South, and Midwest becoming massive and congested thanks to the construction of accessible railways. For the Irish suffering from the potato famine and the Germans experiencing the fallout of the revolutions of 1848, these changing conditions made a new life promising. Upon arrival, however, the reality facing the immigrants was far different than their expectations. In a world where safe working conditions and the 8-hour day were still a far cry away, migrants that took up menial jobs as factory workers and longshoremen found themselves regularly fleeced by their bosses while residing in filthy, overcrowded slums like New York's Five Points. As the newcomers succumbed to gang life and prostitution, the American political establishment took to moral panic and nativism, fearing that the poverty and Catholicism of Irishmen and Germans would alter the Protestant, socially pure character of the nation for the worse. By the outbreak of the Civil War, with the South seceding as the Confederate States of America in order to preserve slavery, immigrants across the continent found themselves in an awkward position. As an alien group with little connection to their host country and its internal conflict, Irish and German communities took to varying degrees of support or opposition to the Union and Confederate war effort, depending on how much autonomy their respective region allowed them, with those that gave migrants more independence receiving considerable help from newcomers, while more nativist areas aroused more foreign backlash. Compared to the rest of the country, the immigrants of northern cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia had the smallest chance of fighting for their self-interest on a large scale. This was true from their most bare working standards, where migrant laborers in factories and construction sites were not allowed to become managers, and were divided on personal habits so as not to create a strong collective. The fact that most of their bosses came from Anglo-Saxon Protestant backgrounds must have created tense resentment from the Irish, since it resembled their agrarian past, where English landlords reaped much of the profit despite doing no physical work. Another group that was offended by these arrangements were the German artisans, who came from backgrounds of self-employed intellectuals, but lost this respected reputation with the influx of unskilled colleagues that they had to work with. Although highly discriminated at work, Irish and German immigrants found much more stable community in their neighborhoods, with the Irish tending to cluster near the docks that employed them, and Germans forming Klein Deutschlands, or Little Germanys, that were respected enclaves with theaters, newspaper offices, and beer halls where English was rarely spoken. For the Anglo-Saxon establishment of the North, who were steeped in temperance and devotion to Protestantism, the frequent gang life, heavy drinking, and common prostitution of these groups was enough to excite disgust. Perhaps the most frightening characteristic of these immigrants was their Catholicism, which the Protestant elite felt mirrored an un-American kind of tyranny in its subservience to the Pope. At exclusive social organizations like New York's Union Club, founding members came up with solutions to the immigrant problem that were blatantly paternalistic in tone, with urban planner Frederick Law Olmsted building parks in these communities in order to promote good manners among supposed ruffians, and Boston's school superintendent John Philbrook wanting to send Catholic boys to industrial schools since they were too low in the depths of vice, crime, and poverty. At their very core, the northern politicians that formed the Republican Party of 1860 wanted to exclude Irish and German immigrants as much as possible, preferring wage labor be done by black Americans due to their Protestantism, and, in the words of diarist George Templeton Strong, viewing the migrants as scum that ought to be rooted out violently. Even the political alternatives presented to immigrants showed a limited kind of support. While the Republicans called for a swift abolition to slavery and closed borders, the Northern Democrats were considerably friendlier to aliens by being indifferent to slavery and being in favor of open borders. An appealing element to this party was that many of its leaders came from similar outsider backgrounds, like Rothschild agent August Belmont being foreign-born, and New York Governor Horatio Seymour profiting off the Erie Canal that employed many migrant workers. Other than these performative alliances, the Democrats did not care about the plight of their immigrant audience. When New York Mayor Fernando Wood gave out bread to rioters in 1857, his egalitarian policies alienated his own party, with donor John A. Dix saying, "If there are any who would excite the laborer against the capitalist, they are no friends of the Republic." Clearly, Even the official representatives of Catholic neighborhoods wanted to keep the masses on a controlled leash, providing them with minimal standards of citizenship in exchange for continued support to corrupt political machines like Tammany Hall, whose profit from free trade rarely trickled back to constituents. The most amount of genuine support for immigrants came from the immigrant communities themselves, with German refugees wanting to replicate the socialism they fought for in the revolutions of 1848. In workers' councils like the Industrial Congress of 1850, founding members declared that Southern chattel slavery and Northern wage labor were two kinds of the same capitalist evil, and that they sought to represent the interests of both underclasses, although this grassroots activism often did not bear fruition. Upon enlisting in the Civil War, Irishmen and Germans were at first very enthusiastic towards the effort, with the Irish viewing the Union and Fenian fights for liberty as one and the same. As the fighting dragged on, immigrant regiments drew heavier losses from the Union's failed military campaigns in Virginia, and from battles like Antietam, where thousands of troops on both sides died in unprecedented numbers due to the rise of modern warfare, with newer weapons like rifles and revolvers drawing higher body counts because of their increased accuracy. During these trying times, the xenophobia that immigrants and their sons experienced seemed unbearable, as northern newspapers blamed the humiliating loss at Chancellorsville on Germans. Irish New Yorker James B. Turner summed up his kin's collective disillusionment in a letter to his father, writing, "Think of lying, eating, and daily life in a small tent, with from 7 to 10 men, none of them the cleanest or with any pretense to education or refinement, then being cursed and cuffed about by some vulgar wretch in authority." More salt was poured on the wound when representatives of these foreign-born communities, like the German officer Franz Siegel or the Irish-American George McClellan, were dismissed from the army despite their popularity with immigrant troops, all of whom were from the northern cities of these officers' regiments. The decades' worth of smoldering resentment came to a blow on July 13th, 1863, when, after the costly Battle of Gettysburg, the Union announced that it would be drafting its men. Since black Americans were not yet considered citizens, and wealthy men could buy their way out of the draft, the majority that would be conscripted were the urban white working class. To the Irish or German immigrant, the prospect of being forced to serve under nativists for the freedom of a group that would be future labor competition was wholly offensive. As the draft was being announced in the early morning in New York, rioters senselessly beat policemen, ransacked abolitionist homes along Lexington Avenue, and tried to cut down telegraph lines. With unrest wearing on, immigrants took on brutally racist attacks, razing the colored orphan asylum to the ground, tossing black longshoremen into the East River, and threatening white prostitutes known to cater to black men. Disturbingly, the most heinous attacks were not committed by Irish and German men of fighting age, since they often refrained from fighting once the draft was paused the following day. Instead, much of the violence committed during the whole week of the New York draft riots was committed by boys from these migrant communities, who were often under the age of 16. In an environment where these boys could not be afforded the apprenticeship that their ancestors received, and were being disproportionately beaten in Protestant public schools, these heinous attacks were likely the result of barren opportunity. Ultimately, the most effective solution to the biggest case of immigrant unrest in American history was not martial law from the northern elite, but from the local community, with priests being sent out to make peace with their church attendees, and neighborhood authorities issuing conscription to Irish and German migrants in the region without issue for the rest of the war. Fears around incoming immigrants was not just restricted to the North. As territories in the Midwest were becoming industrialized states that were connected to the Union through railways and canals, the Protestant establishment was desperate to claim the budding culture of the region as its own. Lyman Beecher represented this view in his play A Plea for the West, where he warned that the new region could be corrupted by an alien group that was unacquainted with our institutions, unaccustomed to self-government, and inaccessible to education. Luckily for the immigrants of the Midwest, they were about as new to the region as their native-born counterparts, and so they found an ample environment to express their religion and culture. The relative independence of immigrants in the Midwest could be seen at the most primary level with the education of their children. Unlike the North, where public schools instituted mandatory readings of the Protestant King James Bible, nuns and priests in the Midwest had the resources to start their own form of education for their community's children. This effort was successful across the Midwest, with Catholic schools in Cincinnati enrolling 6,000 children, and Catholic schools in Chicago rivaling the number of public ones, both of these records being set by 1860. The ability of being raised in the religious tradition of their parents had a uniformly positive effect on immigrant youth, with school attendance rates in Illinois being substantially higher than those in Massachusetts. This trend of autonomy spilled over into prosperous living standards. In a similar vein to the Catholic schools of Midwestern cities, Father Edward Sorin bought a large tract of land near the University of Notre Dame in Indiana that was explicitly meant for Irish immigrants. The enclave was designed to give an otherwise destitute group easy access to property, education, and worship, which installed them with a beneficial continuation of their culture. As opposed to the average Irish family in New York's 5 Points, families in this community in Indiana could afford the same earthenware that they had in rural Ireland, giving them a much more comfortable life as a result. With well-adjusted living standards, the Irish and German communities of the Midwest found enough reason to support the Union by the time of the Civil War. This was most evident at the outbreak of the conflict, with audiences enthusiastically enlisting into the Army at Cincinnati's Catholic Union Hall, and the Irish population of Grand Rapids, Michigan, equaling the native-born in recruitment ranks. While immigrants in the North had their officers regularly dismissed, those in the Midwest were able to keep popular officers from their communities, with Illinois Governor Richard Yates exclusively assigning German officers to regiments of the same ethnicity, and placing the Irish-born Timothy O'Meara in the 90th Illinois Volunteer Company, otherwise known as the Irish Legion. O'Meara was able to stop disorderly conduct going on in the group once assigned, and immigrants from the Midwest remained consistently loyal, even as war weariness dragged on. Unlike the institutional nativism of the North or the open space of the Midwest, the South enjoyed a relationship with the Irish and German immigrants that was the most muted and pragmatic out of any region. This was largely due to numbers, as aliens comprised a tiny fraction of the area's population, with Germans accounting for about 1% of the Confederacy, and the ethnic Irish living on the outskirts of cities like Savannah. In southern cities, this minority was respected, with Irish industrial and domestic workers earning more than their Union counterparts due to less competition and free labor, while residing in more spacious and comfortable tenements. Peaceful coexistence extended across religious lines as well, with German Jews experiencing comfort in their host communities as doctors, teachers, and merchants that sold African slaves, with them supporting the custom due to its appearance in the Hebrew Bible. Tolerance for these immigrants came at a limit if any of them questioned slavery's legitimacy. An instance of this occurred in 1853, when German immigrants in San Antonio founded an abolitionist newspaper called the Zeitung, and were all run out of Texas 2 years later because of their vocal opposition to slavery. As the Confederacy went to war, immigrants did what they could to support their host country, despite being in an awkward position. In New Orleans, German merchants made embassies that professed their home state's allegiance to the South, while their wives staged food relief programs throughout the city. Even when sharing an alliance that crossed identities, immigrants did not show as deep a connection to the custom of slavery than their native-born peers. A prime instance of this occurred when Patrick Cleburne, an Irish-turned-Confederate officer, proposed that slaves be freed in exchange for service to the Confederacy, an idea that was quickly shot down by his superiors. When the South immediately faced issues of debt and wartime rationing, the general public and government of the Confederacy took to the ambivalent immigrants as a source of blame. This discrimination was most prominent in the capital of Richmond, where German residents were routinely confiscated of their property and arrested for treason. Meanwhile, Irish families in the city were more often than not left destitute, leaving them to participate in the 1863 bread riots around Richmond. Confederate suspicion around migrants turned conspiratorial, with there being theories that Germans were planning to assassinate President Jefferson Davis. As they became unwelcome in the eyes of the crumbling Confederacy, Irish and German immigrants were considerably friendlier to Union authorities upon the South's reintegration, reporting low cases of civil unrest and discomfort in the reformed United States. Across both Union and Confederate lines, Irish and German immigrants' support or opposition to the war effort was marked by strong self-interest. As a group that primarily consisted of single young men, many of whom were expected to return home soon, this was not a base that had, or cared much about, a storied connection to the United States and its relationship with slavery. Such a position resulted in constant tensions with their respective host regions, with the newcomers being perceived as a source of credible suspicion, and the aliens in turn viewing the institutions around them as antagonistic and oppressive. These intense feelings played out in each region depending on how ingrained nativism was, with there being more foreign-born hostilities when regions tried to assimilate immigrants to a Protestant system, and there being more migrant support when there is considerable respect and autonomy given to Catholicism, foreign languages, and localized education or living standards. This case study shines a light on the dynamics of immigration and its relationship to wartime, with preservation of native culture being essential to newcomers, so essential that it may play into needed loyalty to one's host country.